was the greatest.
Allen Iverson was never a story about basketball. Basketball was just a backdrop, a tool, a microphone. The real story of Allen Iverson is about the conflict between the individual and the system, about what happens when talent is born in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and refuses to apologize for who it is. Iverson was never meant to fit in, and for a long time, the NBA wasn't ready for that dive from the very beginning. He was different, not just in height, body type, or style of play, but in energy. Iverson didn't look like someone chasing a dream. He looked like someone fighting for the right to breathe. When people talked about his lack of adaptability, few ever asked why. Why should he adapt to a world that had made it clear since childhood that it never planned on including him anyway? Iverson never tried to be a role model. He was proof. Hampton, Virginia wasn't a place where the future was planned. It was a place where you dealt with the present day, where survival counted as success. Iverson grew up without a father, surrounded by chaos, violence, and constant pressure. His mother, Ann, was his anchor. She held the family together in an environment that usually tore families apart. Allen learned very early that the world isn't fair, and that authority isn't automatically on your side. The police weren't protection. School wasn't a guarantee. Rules weren't neutral, and that worldview carved itself deep into him. The streets taught him speed, not sprinting reaction, reading situations, the ability to sense danger before it appeared. Those skills later transferred to the court. Iverson didn't play by schemes. He played by instinct. He knew when to attack and when to disappear, when to risk and when to provoke. That wasn't anarchy. That was adaptation, the same adaptation you need when you grow up in a place where a mistake can have real consequences. Sport was his outlet, but not an escape in the romantic sense. It wasn't a dream of the NBA. It was a way to earn respect. Allen Iverson was exceptional into sports at the same time basketball and American football. As a quarterback, he had vision, leadership instinct, and composure under pressure. He led his team to a state championship and was considered one of the greatest talents in the history of Virginia. That's not a detail. That's the key. From the start, Iverson learned to carry responsibility, to lead, to decide, and to live with the consequences. His game was aggressive, but never cowardly. He didn't shy away. He didn't play it safe. Every contact was personal. Every matchup a test of identity. For Iverson, sport wasn't entertainment. It was conflict, a place where a person's value is proven. And that's why he was so uncompromising. He didn't know how to switch off. He didn't know how to play just for fun. Then came the moment that was supposed to end everything. The bowling alley incident in 1993, a racially charged situation, chaos, riots. Iverson was labeled the main culprit. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, 15 years for an incident many witnesses described very differently. But the truth didn't matter then. The image did. A young black kid from a troubled neighborhood. The media had its story. Society had its culprit. This is where Iverson's life breaks. Not because he made a mistake, but because he understood how little it takes for the system to write you off. At an age when others were thinking about college, he was thinking about prison. A future that had seemed wide open just a week earlier slammed shut overnight. He was saved only by the intervention of the governor of Virginia, who overturned the sentence. Officially, he was free. Unofficially, he was marked forever. That experience planted a distrust in him that never left. His second chance came from John Thompson at Georgetown, and this is one of the most important moments in the entire story. Thompson wasn't just a coach. He was an authority who didn't want to change Iverson but to guide him. He took him under his protection at a time when most programs had turned him away. He set clear rules, no excuses, no alibis. The discipline was strict, but for the first time in his life, Iverson felt that on the other side stood someone who didn't want to break him, only to keep him standing. Georgetown wasn't a fairy tale. It was a filter, a hard, unforgiving filter designed to separate talent from trouble. And Allen Iverson entered it already branded, not as a clean freshman with a blank slate, but as a player whose name already carried a story, context, and stigma. Everyone knew where he came from. Everyone knew the incident. And that's why Georgetown was never just about basketball. Every practice, every game, every interview was a test of whether Iverson could fit, not into a system of play, but into a system of expectations. He was a star, but not a comfortable one. He wasn't the type around whom you build a calm narrative of talent, development, and future promise. He was explosive, fast, unpredictable, and above all watched. While other players could make mistakes and treat them as part of learning, Iverson's mistakes carried a different weight. Every foul was analyzed. Every technical was interpreted as evidence of character. Every gesture was read through the lens of his past. The media never really saw him as a Georgetown player. They saw him as the kid who was supposed to go to prison, and that frame followed him everywhere. And yet he dominated, not because he had ideal conditions, but precisely because he didn't. Iverson's talent was undeniable. Speed, first step, instinct, the ability to read the game before it happened. This wasn't a talent you could smooth into a textbook form. It was raw, sharp, sometimes uncomfortable. His style wasn't elegant in the traditional sense. It wasn't built on grace, but on pressure, on constantly disrupting the opponent's balance. He played as if every second were a fight for space, and that both terrified and fascinated people at the same time. NBA scouts sat in the stands and saw two things at once. They saw a genius, and they saw a problem. They saw a player who could shred a defense with ease, but also one who didn't fit into a pre-designed template. In their notebooks appeared words that showed up less often with other prospects: attitude, discipline, risk. Not because Iverson didn't work, but because he worked differently. He didn't arrive with the face of a future face of the league. He arrived with an identity that was already fully formed, and he had no intention of changing it. This is where his lifelong conflict begins to take shape. Freedom versus control. Authenticity versus image. Iverson wasn't ready to become a product. He didn't know how to shrink himself. He didn't know how to adapt to expectations that he should be grateful, humble, polished. And the basketball world wasn't yet ready to accept a player who refused to apologize for where he came from. At Georgetown, he delivered everything that was asked of him in terms of performance. He was elite, but he was never comfortable, and that's crucial. Comfort was a trait the system valued more than raw truth. College basketball taught him one essential lesson: performance alone is not enough. That there are people for whom you will never be acceptable until you change. Until you change how to speak, how you dress, how to move, how to react. Iverson learned that lesson quickly, and he made a decision that defined his entire life. He didn't change. He didn't soften. He didn't lose his edges. He kept playing the same way: hard, fast, instinctive, because those edges were his weapons. And you don't lay down your weapons just to make others more comfortable. As the draft approached, it was clear this wouldn't be just a basketball decision. The 1996 draft was stacked with names that would define the league for decades. Safe picks, elegant profiles, players who were easy to sell to fans and sponsors. And yet, with the first pick came Allen Iverson. That decision wasn't rational in the traditional sense. It was truthful. Philadelphia didn't choose the biggest body. It didn't choose the cleanest image. It chose a player who embodied the city's mentality of toughness, defiance, emotion. Iverson didn't arrive as a savior promising the future. He arrived as a fighter ready to go to war immediately, and the fans recognized it instantly. They saw themselves in him. But the NBA wasn't Hampton. It wasn't Georgetown. It was a league of giants, systems, and hierarchies. A league where respect was often inherited through name and status. Iverson was small, light, vulnerable. Every collision could hurt. Every fall could mean the end. And yet he played without fear. He didn't protect himself. He didn't avoid contact. He attacked bigger, stronger players as if every drive were proof that he was afraid of nothing. His rookie season wasn't polished. It was chaotic, explosive, full of points, fouls, arguments, and controversy. Iverson didn't look like someone who was learning. He looked like someone who refused to slow down. Coaches were focused on how to tame him, not how to develop him. How to tame him. The media debated whether he was even the right kind of role model. And in the meantime, Iverson did the only thing he knew how to do: play. Not by schemes, not by expectations, by instinct. His game was a direct reflection of the street. Fast decisions, instant reactions, sudden changes of direction, constant pressure. It wasn't mindless chaos. It was improvisation rooted in reading situations and ability to sense a weakness. before the defense even realized it was there. Impossible to understand for purists, mesmerizing for fans. And then came that move, the crossover. Iverson against Michael Jordan. For many people, just a highlight. For Iverson's story, a defining moment. It wasn't about being the greatest player in history. It was about how he did it. No pause, no hesitation, no respectful distance that young players were expected to keep. That move mocked hierarchy. It declared that names aren't shields. That authority isn't protected by the past, but by the present. To the old generation, it was disrespect. To the young generation, it was a signal that something was changing. At the same time, Iverson's relationship with the league off the court began to fracture. Cornrows, tattoos, baggy clothes, a hip-hop identity. Iverson looked different and refused to hide it. It wasn't provocation, it was authenticity. For the first time in league history, there was a player who brought his entire world into the NBA and had no intention of leaving it at the door. The NBA began to realize this wasn't just about one player. It was a cultural shift it didn't fully control. Iverson wasn't a marketing product. He was reality. And reality is hard to manage. This is the period when the Iverson we know is fully born, not just as a talent but as a symbol of resistance to uniformity, a symbol of a player who refused to trade his identity for comfort, calm, or approval. Every one of his games was more than a performance. It was a continuation of a question hovering over his career from day one. Does a star have to submit to the system, or will the system eventually adapt to the star? And the answer Iverson gave his entire life was always the same: wordless, uncompromising. On the court. When people today talk about the press conference that entered history under a single word, practice, they almost always talk about a shortcut, a meme, a short clip that's easy to share, parody, and ridicule. A few seconds torn from dozens of minutes, stripped of context, emotion, and understanding. And that's exactly why this moment matters so much. Not because of what was said, but because of what was lost. If there is one moment that exposes the gap between who Allen Iverson truly was and how he was perceived, it's this press conference. That day, a confident rebel who despised work, responsibility, or the system did not stand before the reporters, nor was it a spoiled talent who thought he could get away with anything. What stood there was a man at rock bottom, mentally, emotionally, physically. Iverson was exhausted in a way that can't be measured by statistics. He was carrying a personal loss that was never spoken about loudly enough. He held pain he had no time to process because the season never waits. Games come one after another. Expectations don't build gradually, they're constant. The pressure never lets up. His body was broken, literally, knees, ankles. Back everything bore the marks of years spent playing a way that defied physics. Iverson was never a player who avoided contact. On the contrary, he sought it out. Not because he was a masochist, but because that's how he'd been taught to play. Every drive was a battle. Every fall a confirmation that he was still standing. And on top of all that came the moment when he sat in front of reporters and, instead of being asked how he felt, what he was going through, how he was handling loss, he heard the same thing over and over again: practice, attendance, discipline. As if everything he sacrificed on the court had suddenly ceased to exist. In that moment, Iverson wasn't trying to defend himself. He wasn't making excuses. He was trying to explain one simple thing that seemed obvious to him: that the game is what matters. That's where he risks everything. That's where he's 100% present. That's where he puts his body, his reputation, and his career on the line. Practice wasn't a formality he ignored. It was preparation for war. But war isn't fought in an empty gym. War is fought at night, in front of a packed arena, against people trying to stop you. But the media wasn't looking for an explanation. It was looking for a shortcut, a sentence that could be pulled out, twisted, and used as proof of an already existing narrative. And it found it. One sentence, one word. The rest of the context disappeared. It didn't fit. It didn't sell. And in that moment, Iverson understood something fundamental. Authenticity isn't always rewarded with understanding. Sometimes it's punished with ridicule. That telling the truth isn't enough if it doesn't fit a pre-approved image. From that point on, Iverson stopped defending himself, not because he had nothing to say, but because he realized no one was listening anyway. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. Accumulated emotion, frustration, grief, and anger didn't vanish, they just changed form. And from that silence, from that inner pressure, the 2000 to 2001 season was born. One of the most demanding individual seasons the NBA has ever seen. A season that makes no sense if you look only at the standings, but makes perfect sense if you see it as the response of a man who chose to answer in the only way he knew through play. Philadelphia at the time wasn't built on stars. It wasn't a collection of talent. It wasn't a super team. It was structure, defense, roles, and one man who had to create something out of nothing every night. Iverson wasn't just a leader. He was the engine, the offense, the creative source, the emotional center, and the identity of the team all in one body. When something stalled, it went through him. When points were needed, it went through him. When energy had to be lifted, it went through him. Every opponent knew it. Every defense was prepared. Double teams, traps on the pick and roll, hard fouls, physical play, and still it wasn't enough. Iverson played at a pace that defied human limits. Constant drives into bodies, constant falls, constant contact with taller, heavier players. There was no plan B, no night when he could slow down and hide behind the system. Every game was existential. Every basket was earned, not aesthetically, not elegantly, by sheer will. That's why his MVP from that season has nothing to do with beauty in the traditional sense. It wasn't an award for efficiency, pristine shooting percentages, or textbook basketball. It was an award for burden, for how much pain, pressure, and responsibility one person can carry without breaking. Iverson wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't even the most protected by the system. And yet he was the most essential. When the 2001 NBA Finals arrived, most of the world thought it was already settled. Standing opposite Philadelphia were the Los Angeles Lakers, a team that looked like it came from another world. Indestructible, perfectly balanced, dominant inside thanks to Shaquille O'Neal, lethal on the perimeter thanks to Kobe Bryant. They had gone through the playoffs without a single loss. They were a machine. The finals were supposed to be a formality, a quick confirmation of hierarchy. The story had a clear ending before it even began. And then came game one. Iverson stepped onto the floor as if he had a personal dispute with reality itself. He didn't play smart. He didn't play cautiously. He played boldly. He risked every drive, took every hit, fell, got up, and went again. 48 points weren't a statistical explosion. They were defiance. Every basket was proof that even a perfect system can collide with pure will. Philadelphia won. The Lakers lost for the first time in the playoffs. That one game didn't change the outcome of the series, but it changed the narrative. Suddenly, Iverson was no longer just an outsider trying to survive, no longer just a small guard defying physics. He was a threat, a real one, unignorable. He showed that even if you can't defeat the system in the long run, you could stop it for a moment, and sometimes that's enough. And then came the image that became an icon of an entire era. Iverson falls to the floor after the shot, lies there, gets up, and steps over Tyronn Lue, the step over. One gesture that carried more than 1,000 words. To some, disrespect. To others, provocation. To Iverson, released a detonation of years of frustration, years of being questioned, years of being told he was too small, too problematic, too undisciplined. That step wasn't over an opponent. It was over doubt, over the past, over everyone who was waiting for him to break. But that peak had a dark side. Iverson's game was built on sacrifice, on ignoring the body's warning signs, on the belief that backing down meant losing. Injuries didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly, quietly. Pain became a daily reality. There wasn't one breaking moment. There was gradual erosion. Every collision took a small piece of the future. Every fall shortened the time that remained. Iverson's prime wasn't long and stable. It was short, intense, and consuming, like a flame that burns too brightly to last. But that's precisely why it can't be ignored. Because in those years, Iverson wasn't just playing basketball. He was playing to be heard, to be seen, to be understood. And even if it didn't happen the way he hoped, he left a mark that cannot be erased. After 2001, Allen Iverson didn't change. And that's where the problem defining the next chapter of his career begins. Allen Iverson remained who he had always been, a player who played all out, without calculation, without reserve, without protective layers. He played as if every game might be his last, as if every hesitation meant a return to the beginning. But the NBA was changing, slowly but irreversibly. The league was moving toward efficiency, systems, long-term sustainability. Chaos that had once been read as authenticity began to be read as risk, and Iverson, without taking a single step aside, found himself in a space where there was no longer a natural place for him. Philadelphia was home to Iverson in the deepest sense of the word. It wasn't just a team, it was a city that understood pain, frustration, and defiance. A city that never tried to be perfect, but was always real. Iverson gave it everything. There was never a night he stepped onto the court thinking about saving himself. Every game was a personal statement, every fall part of the identity. But that very symbiosis eventually began to hit its limits. The organization started thinking in different horizons about the future, about health, about stability, about whether it was possible to keep building everything on one body, one mind, one style of play so extreme it exacted a price every time it touched the hardwood. Iverson felt the shift in atmosphere before it was ever said out loud. He began to feel that he was no longer seen as the solution, but as a variable that needed to be controlled. Talk began about balance, about changing direction, about the team needing a different kind of leadership. For Iverson, it was a foreign language. He didn't know balance. He knew only maximum. In his world, things were done all the way or not at all. And the moment he was asked to slow down, to step back, to be less visible, his relationship with Philadelphia began to unravel. Not with an explosion, not with a scandal, but with the quiet exhaustion of two sides that loved each other, yet could no longer breathe together. Leaving Philadelphia wasn't a defeat. It wasn't betrayal. It was an acknowledgement of reality. An era built on extremes had reached its limits. Iverson left the city that shaped him with the feeling that a part of his identity was leaving with him, and that's why the next step was so difficult. Denver was supposed to be a new beginning, new air, a new story, a place to start over without the weight of the past. But the past can't be taken off like a jersey dot in Denver. Iverson found himself for the first time in a situation where he wasn't automatically the center of the universe. The team had a different axis, a different future, a different plan. Beside him stood a young talent meant to be the face of the next decade. On paper, an ideal combination of experience and youth, intensity and potential. But reality was more complicated. Iverson had spent his entire life in environments where, when things broke down, the ball went to him. In Denver, for the first time, he was asked to give the ball up, to share space, to be part of the equation, not its solution. This wasn't a question of ego. It was a question of identity. Iverson wasn't raised to step aside. He was raised to fight, and fighting always happened with the ball in his hands. On the court, he kept proving he still had something to offer. The points came, the energy too, but something was missing, a sense of inner meaning. Iverson began to look like someone who was playing the right way, but not living the right way. The compromise people had talked about for years arrived at a moment when he wasn't mentally ready for it. Denver wasn't a failure. It was a warning, proof that the league had moved to a place where there was no longer a natural home. For Iverson's style, Detroit took that conflict to its extreme. Here, there were no nuances left. This was philosophy. Detroit embodied the system, collective over individual, role over instinct, discipline over emotion. Iverson found himself in an environment that was his exact opposite. For the first time in his career, he was asked to fit in, to be one of many, to submit to a structure that didn't need his chaos, only his obedience. This moment is crucial to understanding his fall. Iverson wasn't a player who rejected team basketball. He rejected the erasure of his identity. In Detroit, for the first time, he didn't feel like someone who could express himself through basketball. His instinct was suppressed, his role reduced, and with that, his purpose was erased. The criticism no longer targeted his performances, it targeted who he was. And that's a break few athletes ever recover from, because there's no training for it, no system, no plan. Memphis was the final attempt, the last chance to give the story a calm ending. But instead of a period, came the hardest lesson. Iverson was asked to be a veteran off the bench, a mentor, a voice in the locker room, a role that makes sense from an organizational perspective, a role that is the logical outcome of a long career. But for Iverson, it was almost impossible. His entire life had been defined by an active role, direct confrontation, immediate impact. When that possibility disappeared, there was nothing left to lean on. He didn't leave because he was bad. He didn't leave because he lacked talent. He left because he didn't know how to exist halfway. He was either Allen Iverson or he wasn't, and the NBA didn't know how to deal with someone who refused to become a legend in the background. His ending was quiet, and that silence was the most painful part. No farewell, no final game, no moment where the league publicly acknowledged who it was losing. Iverson simply disappeared from rotations, from plans, from the future. After his career came a reality no contract prepares you for. Life without the rhythm of a season, without daily structure, without adrenaline. The money that had come quickly began to disappear just as fast. Iverson had always been a man of the moment. Now he had to face time. Financial problems became a public topic without empathy, without context. Few people ask what happens to someone who lived their entire life at an extreme and then suddenly loses the extreme. Ironically, he was ultimately saved by his Reebok contract, which secured his financial future later in life. Symbolic. The system held him up only when it no longer wanted anything from him. Iverson had to learn how to exist without the role that defined him, without the ball, without the crowd, without the daily fight, and that may have been the hardest battle of his life. This part of his story isn't about an athletic decline. It's about the collision between identity and time, about a man who helped change the league, but couldn't and perhaps didn't want to change with it. Allen Iverson didn't disappear because he stopped being good. He disappeared because he stayed authentic in a world that began to fear authenticity. When Allen Iverson finally vanished from NBA courts, it didn't mean the end of his story. It only meant the end of one chapter, the most visible one. The chapter measured in minutes, points, and statistics. What followed was quieter, less photogenic, but perhaps more important, because it was only when Iverson stopped playing that it became fully clear who he really was, and why his imprint on the NBA goes beyond basketball itself. Life after his career wasn't easy for Iverson. The daily rhythm disappeared. The reason to get up, prepare, and fight was gone. His entire life had been structured around the game, not around weeks, months, or years, but around the night, around the moment, and suddenly, the moment was gone. What remained was silence, and in that silence, things surfaced that had been pushed aside during his career: financial reality, personal mistakes, fatigue with nowhere to release it. The media seized on it quickly. Iverson was once again presented as a warning, as an example of how uncontrolled talent can end. But once again, it was a simplified image, just as superficial as the one that followed him his entire life. In reality, Iverson was slowly learning how to exist without the role that had defined him, without the ball, without the crowd, without the need to prove anything. And it was during this period that a reassessment of his legacy began. Fans, former players, and a younger generation started to look at him differently, not through headlines, not through memes, but through influence. And that influence was everywhere. When Allen Iverson was inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame, it wasn't a formal ceremony. It wasn't a box to check. It was an emotional release. Iverson didn't stand on stage as a polished veteran with everything neatly resolved. He stood there as a man who had walked a path full of conflict, pain, and misunderstanding. He spoke about his mother, about his coaches, about the people who stood by him when it was at its worst. He cried not because he was weak, but because he no longer had to hide anything. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being judged. He was being accepted. That moment mattered not only to him, but to the league itself. It was a quiet admission that Iverson wasn't a mistake, that he wasn't a problem to be solved. He was a reality the league didn't know how to handle for a long time, and only with distance did it understand that this very reality pushed it forward. Today, his influence is visible everywhere, in how players dress, how they speak, how they show emotion, how they refuse to be just a product. Without Iverson, there would be no space for players who bring their full identity into the NBA without apology. Players like Kyrie Irving, Ja Morant, or an entire generation of guards who played with the ball as an extension of their own bodies, grew up on Iverson, not just on his game, but on his stance on the idea that it's possible to be different and still belong among the elite. Iverson also changed how the NBA relates to culture. Cornrows, tattoos, hip-hop, streetwear, these were once seen as problems, as things to regulate, smooth out, and adapt. Today, they're part of the league's identity, part of its marketing, part of the authenticity the NBA sells to the world. And there's a certain irony in that. What Iverson was criticized for became the norm. What was seen as a threat turned out to be the future. His story is often interpreted today as a warning, a lesson about discipline, money, and adaptation. But that's another simplification. Iverson's story isn't a warning, it's a mirror. It shows what happens when exceptional talent is born into an environment that knows no way to handle it other than control. It shows how thin the line is between genius and a problem when you look at a person only through norms, not through context. Allen Iverson was never perfect. He never tried to be. He made mistakes, many of them public, many of them costly, but he never stopped being real. He never accepted a role that wasn't his just to make things more comfortable for others. And that's why his legacy endured, not in the standings, not in championship counts, but in how he changed the perception of individuality within a collective sport. Today, with the benefit of distance, Iverson's story may resonate more powerfully than it did while he was playing. Back then, he was too close, too loud, too uncomfortable. Today, it's clear the NBA didn't need to tame him. It needed to learn how to live with difference. And that lesson goes far beyond sports. In the end, Allen Iverson didn't win his battle with the system by defeating it. He won by changing it, slowly, quietly, without ever trying to, simply by staying himself until the very end. And that's why his name today doesn't just mean one player. It means a stance, an identity, proof that even in the most controlled environment, authenticity can survive and eventually win.